please, like, if you're not listening to Alberta Advantage, please listen. It's a really good podcast. It's not, I mean, I think whether you're Canadian or wherever you're from, it's a great team. It's not always focused on Alberta, although I think learning about Alberta is interesting, especially if you're not really familiar with a lot of stuff about Canada and how it works. It's basically like a like proto-fascist petro-state in and of itself. Really interesting to learn about, and great team behind it. The Alberta Advantage team, also part of the Harbinger Media Network. Jeez, what's going on? I haven't talked enough about Harbinger, but that's launching very soon. The podcast network, of course, that I've been working on over the last couple of months. My show, 49th Parallel, is part of that. Alberta Advantage. It's a really like an unbeatable lineup of like leftist podcast content. I'm really looking forward to that launching. Okay, let's listen to Alberta Advantage.
Makes no difference where I go, you're the best hometown.
The Alberta Advantage is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network. Check out our partner shows at harbingermedianetwork.com. This independent listener-supported podcast is possible thanks to listeners like you. If you think what we do is important, support us with a monthly donation at patreon.com/Alberta Advantage.
Calgary, you know we love you.
Hello and welcome to the Alberta Advantage. I am your host, Kate Jacobson, and joining me today is Brendan.
Hello.
And our guest, Tyler Shipley, Professor of Culture, Society, and Commerce at Humber College and author of Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. Tyler, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you guys for having me.
So you've written what should be basically a textbook, I think, to the project that is known as Canada, and it runs from colonization, or the first instances of colonization, rather, all the way to recent foreign policy. And through this history, your argument is that the project of Canada is consistent from that initial colonization to the present. So could you explain what you mean with the book's subtitle, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination, and why you believe these terms are essential to understanding Canada?
Yeah, the project sort of started with, well, there was a bunch of things, but in particular, there was a course I was teaching about Canadian foreign policy, and I did something that seemed obvious, I guess, or intuitive to me, which is that I started the course with colonialism and spent the first few weeks kind of establishing Canada's colonial sort of roots. My students were often surprised.
Low Dane, we got to have that term in there for sure.
They wanted to know about Canada going out in the world and having foreign relations. It was sort of in the process of explaining to my students why I included colonialism that I realized this is something that isn't done enough, actually. At least it's not articulated enough by people in Canada and even by the Canadian left that it's important to think about colonialism as foreign policy. The English, the French, and later Canada were, encountering and interacting with foreign nations. It's the height of colonialism that has been erased and converted into some kind of domestic, business, an internal problem of Canada, because these were foreign nations and the colonizers understood that, and certainly the indigenous nations understood that. So the book is premised on the idea that if you look at colonialism, this sort of foundational first case of Canadian foreign policy, you will find the kind of, I guess, the basis upon which all the rest of Canada's engagements in the world are premised. And so that's where the subtitle comes in. And the subtitle of the book, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination, refers to the two, I guess, central pieces that I distill out of colonialism that I think, repeat themselves throughout the rest of Canadian history. And I certainly don't mean to oversimplify colonialism. There's, any number of layers and aspects of it. But I think sort of for the purpose of drawing a kind of a broad history of Canada in the world, there's these two things. On the one hand, there is settler capitalism. I mean, that's why Canada exists. Canada was created so that, a section of the French and then British ruling classes landed in North America ruling classes could establish the dynamics of capitalism, the conditions under which they could make profit from the land, eventually from, the factories they built and everything else that was built here. That was the purpose. That's why Canada exists. So settler capitalism then was central to Canadian policy and getting the land in particular, right? Because the land was what Canada needed to build capitalism on. And then the other piece is, I call it the colonial imagination. This is just the sort of basic precepts of white supremacy, the kind of ingrained idea that white people, European, Euro-American people are, I think at some point in the book I say, providentially destined to rule the world because, according to this logic, they are more advanced, more rational, more modern, and they represent the future of the human race. And
This is very interesting to me. Because sometimes when we talk about Israel and like why do we have such strong support for Israel? Why is it so integral that we have this kind of like special bond? And when we ask that question, it can lead people down this kind of dark path that can lead to kind of like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But what the host here, what Tyler Shipley is talking about here when he's describing the Canadian ideological project, you can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this. Thank you so much for subscribing, Vic the Victim. Thank you. When he's talking about the sort of ideological project behind Canada and how we own the land, it's this white supremacist settler capitalism. That's why we have such a strong relationship with Israel, because you can see it's the same project, and we have the same. You can count on me. You're gonna have good old Rob oh my goodness to talk you through all this. Vic the Victim, thank you so much. You can count on me. You're gonna have good old Rob to talk you through all this. I got to figure out how to change this so it doesn't play the animation each time. You can count on me. You're gonna have good old Rob to talk you through all this. My goodness. You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this. You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this. I think that was everything. Was that the last one? Thank you so much, Vic the Victim. That's so cool that you did that for the gifted subs. We really, really appreciate that. So when you hear how he's describing the Canada's ideological project, and you realize like that's why we have such a strong partnership with Israel, just because they're a violent settler colonialist society. They're a violent settler colonialist society, just like we are. And what we're seeing happen right now in Israel and on the Gaza Strip is just like a recreation of the foundational myth of this country, and it's being done for the exact same economic reasons. That's ultimately, and that's why you don't have to go down this like dark path of conspiracy theory about why we have such a strong relationship with Israel. It's just because we have like a commonality like this, and it's part of our economic project to have that footprint in the Middle East as well. It's not that complicated when you really break it down.
One else represents the past. I call it the colonial imagination. This is just the sort of basic precepts of white supremacy, the kind of ingrained idea that white people.
Let me just see if I'm going to bring it on there.
People, European, Euro-American people are, I think at some point in the book I say, providentially destined to rule the world because, according to this logic, they are more advanced, more rational, more modern, and they represent the future of the human race, and everyone else represents the past, indigenous nations, but also, African nations, Asian nations. These are all the past, and white people are the future. This kind of basic idea of white supremacy is how, of course, the early colonizers justify everything they do, the genocide upon which Canada is founded. And it also reproduces itself across the rest of Canadian history. And to me, that was the thing that was so important. I mean, it's important on its own, of course, but the reason I pulled those two pieces and sort of made them central to the analysis was that I was even surprised myself at how regularly they reoccur. And, in every case of foreign policy that I looked at, I found one or the other or both of those two dynamics. So, yeah, that's kind of the idea. That was sort of the premise of the book. And, hopefully it holds up.
I really loved your insistence that the initial colonization of the lands now known as Canada by France and Britain and eventually Canada as foreign policy, because it immediately kind of clarified for me how pervasive the idea is in Canada. That colonization is an issue internal to Canada, and it comes up all of the time in like the language and discourse and the way we talk about these issues. And one of the terms that reminded me of this that always really grates on
Just
me is
tweeting
when people
about this.
say like
Don't mind me.
Indigenous peoples, or like Canada treats its First Nations really badly, which is this very like colonial world building in kind of the language that's being used, and this idea that Indigenous people belong to Canada, and that any conflict between Indigenous people and Canada is, internal to the nation state. So I was really struck by that and your articulation of that.
Yeah, totally. I think you're absolutely right, and it's so subtle, as a lot of Canadian sort of colonial ideology is. It's very subtle. It almost seems on the surface like it's it's inclusive. We're all there's new Canadians, there's Canadians, there's Canada's Indigenous, like as if it's this kind of inclusive project, right? And that's so much of what Canadian nationalism often tries to sell us, is this kind of liberal idea of Canadian inclusiveness. But you're absolutely right. I mean, what it really does, it's erasure, right? I mean, it's a kind of, it's a superficial aspect of the much deeper genocide of Indigenous nations, right? The actual erasing of them, or the attempt, I should say, to erase them, erase them off the land, dispossess them of the land, but also of their identity, of any connection to their culture, and therefore of any right to the land, of any, sort of basis upon which they can claim the land, because that's what it's fundamentally about. And, one of the things I tried to do in the book, carefully, obviously, because these arguments, can be overstated, but I carefully tried to keep coming back to the link between those two, the kind of the material project, which is get the land, and the ideological project, which is, we, the Europeans, deserve to have the land anyways because we're superior. And, those two things really, they're symbiotic, they exist to sustain and support the other. And you can't really have one without the other. And I tried to kind of, carefully draw that out so that on the one hand, I'll give you an example. I found this crazy book. It was super useful to me, but not in the way the authors probably intended. It was this crazy book from the 90s by a couple of, I think, journalists. And the book is called The Great Adventure: How the Mounties Conquered the West. And it is a sort of retelling of the tale of the first Northwest Mounted Police march out west. The predecessor of the RCMP, they're created in Ontario, and they march out west, and they're sort of like the scouts, the precursor to the full-fledged Canadian invasion of the land, sort of from the Red River and west. And it's incredible. A lot of the book is taken from the diaries of these individual colonizers, Northwest Mounted Police officers. And it's really obvious and explicit reading through that book. I mean, I don't recommend reading it. It's heinous, and like the actual reading of it is miserable, and you feel sick to your stomach. But when you read it, you can see so clearly the way the two things, on the one hand, we are there to get the land, and on the other hand, we're better, we're smarter, we're civilized, we're rational. All of those two things are interwoven, and they kind of rely on one another. The assumption that that these Northwest Mounted Police officers make, which is that of course the land is going to eventually belong to Canada, is premised on their idea that they've inherited, that the Indigenous nations aren't capable of, running their own affairs, of properly using the land, whatever other sort of narratives are constructed here. And of course that then turns around and kind of justifies the fact that, well, of course we have to take the land from them. It's a really fascinating read, and like I say, I don't recommend it because it's very unpleasant.
And again, I mean, for this goes back to like there's very strong parallels to the United States, obviously, in the foundation of the United States, manifest destiny, and all this stuff. And it's why it's important, I think, to like, absorb content like this, talking about the foundation of Canada and how there's such a strong similarity, because we've allowed this narrative to develop that, the United States is somehow like uniquely barbaric or genocidal in the foundation of their country. And you can see these same justifications that were used to found Canada in terms of genociding the indigenous populations. I mean, it's the exact same justification that was used to commit the genocide of the Native Americans and to justify the transatlantic slave trade as well. And my keyboard is just straight up not responding now.
Draw
That's
some
not
quotes
great.
from those diaries for the book, and I won't even repeat them because the racism is sort of so horrific. But I mean, it really does give you a sense, I think, a really visceral feel for how those two things were happening in that moment, and how they were, I think, very foundational to what becomes Canada.
Yeah, I found your use of that book really, really fascinating. And I was really struck by the quotes that you draw from these early, Northwest Mounted Police officers, specifically on the subject of the sort of the fact of foreign conquest, and how, these men very much discuss themselves as, going into a foreign country. And yes, they saw it as legitimately, becoming part of Canada so that they could create, civilization there. But they knew that when they went out there, they were going somewhere else. They were among, different nations. So
yeah, that is kind of a robot sound.
Of recognizing that this is, a form of foreign policy, as you say, a form of, an external relationship.
Yeah, and
I think that sounds like, from my producer knowledge, that sounds like a noise removal situation. I think we had a fan or some kind of background noise that's been removed that's giving it that robot effect. That would be my guess.
And if I may, Brendan, too, like what's so interesting about that you just said is that sort of idea that these guys are going into what they call Indian country, right? And they know it's foreign territory. That repeats itself through the rest of the history of Canadian foreign policy, literally in the sense that Canadian soldiers refer to places that they are sent in the world as Indian country. They called Somalia Indian country in the 1990s. They called Afghanistan Indian country in the 2000s. So it's so remarkable, right? Because those men right there in the 1870s, were articulating what ends up being so consistent.
How did Canada respond to the global crises in the period between 1914 and 1945? Because the common understanding of the two world wars, and certainly the understanding that is manufactured by our media and our education system, is that Canada was one of the quote unquote good guys. How does that match up to reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating, I guess, sort of time, in world history. There's so much going on, and it is really incredible that, especially with respect to World War One, that there's this mythology of Canada saving the world, Canada and the United States saving the world for freedom and democracy and human rights, and everything that gets said on Remembrance Day and repeated that is, God, a long way from reality. I guess what I'll say is this.
I've been saying
it into two pieces, or even three. There's the First World War, there's the interwar period, and there's World War II. And in the first two, Canada is unequal.
This is like so. The World War II, and to a certain extent, the World War I stuff is so essential to the like national myth that we've created around this country that never gets pushed back on to the level that it needs to. So this is like really important stuff, especially talking about our role vis-a-vis World War II and the rise of fascism in Europe. And our actions after World War II as well have been very revealing, which I imagine they'll probably get into. What's up, Iron Forward? Welcome. Welcome, sir.
Unequivocally on the wrong side. In the First World War, there isn't a right side. They're all wrong sides.
Hello.
In the interwar period, as fascism is rising, Canada is on the wrong side. Canada sides with fascism. And it's only in World War II itself, the what is commonly called World War II, 1939 to 45, that Canada ends up on the right side of history. That is, on the side that's fighting against fascism. But I'm gonna sort of explain why that happens. In the First World War, essentially it's a war between empires. The German Empire is rising, the British Empire is the sort of predominant capitalist empire. America's waiting in the wings. And World War I is a conflict over, who's going to be at the center of capitalist world supremacy. They're all bad guys, at least, I guess I should say that more thoughtfully. Unless you think the conquest of the rest of the world by Europe is a good thing, they're all bad guys. From the standpoint of the working classes, these are the rich, these are the elite, these are the capitalist elite in all of those countries. From the standpoint of the people of the rest of the world, these are the colonizers. No one in any of Britain or France or Germany's colonies, had any love for their colonizers, and most people didn't.
Hello, Melville's fist.
So there's really no good side in World War I. Certainly, we could say there's no side that's fighting for democracy or freedom or human rights. I mean, that's just a joke. So, Canada lines up with Britain because, of course, it does. Because Canada, is still really deeply connected to the British Empire, and the Canadian elite sees its own interests as being wrapped up in the success of the British Empire, more so than if there had been a German-centered capitalist economy. So Canada throws down with its imperial chums and sends huge number of working class people to their death on behalf of the British Empire. And, on Remembrance Day, when we're asked to sort of, remember the sacrifices of World War I, it's always, I think, kind of insulting because what Remembrance Day does is it tries to actually stop us from remembering what really happened, which is that a lot of working class people died, and we're really angry about it. There was all kinds of protest in Canada against the war. Obviously, in Quebec, the struggles against conscription. Canadian police killed 4 people in Quebec City for protesting against conscription. I mean, this was not some sort of harmonious, everyone across the country is on board with this. Working class people were sick of being sent over there to die for what they increasingly realized was nothing. They knew they were dying for nothing. There's a woman who lost 5 sons in the First World War.
Jesus.
And there was a ceremony after the war where she was, I guess because of the fact that she had lost so many children, she was part of the ceremony, and she was standing with the royal family of Britain. I know that seems crazy, but that's what happened. And she sort of casually remarked to someone she had no idea why all of her sons had died. I mean, this is after the war. Yep. This is at a war ceremony. I mean, that tells you where the working class was at in terms of World War I. So
not just knowing why they died, the purposes, but the actual war itself, just so fucking atrocious. The trench warfare and all that garbage.
Those
awful.
Men who were sent to fight in World War I,
pure hell.
Make a sacrifice. They were sacrificed by the state. So that's Canada in the First World War. The interwar period, of course, and Brent and I talked about this a little bit before we started recording. Europe in the 1920s and 30s, and the world in that period is in crisis, right? And the left is rising and the right is rising, and it's clear that the system as it stands cannot hold, that it's falling apart. Of course, 1929 is the beginning of the Great Depression. So you have, communist movements rising at the same time as the sort of reactionary fascist movements are rising. And Canada, the ruling classes of Canada, are unequivocally on the side of the fascists. Canada is, as I said before, obviously deeply interwoven with the British Empire.
Can't believe that.
States. They are thrilled at the rise of Mussolini in Italy. They actively participate in the rise of Franco in Spain. Now, of course, there were individual working class Canadians who were anti-fascist, right?
Yeah, and I hope he gets into this. We talked about this on the last stream, though, right? The contingent of Canadians who went to fight fascism in the Spanish Civil War against Franco, even though he's saying our government supported Franco. There was Canadians that went to join the Spanish Civil War to fight fascism. And while the war was going on, Canada passed laws to ensure that people couldn't go and volunteer in foreign conflicts for that exact reason, because we supported fascism.
Especially during the Spanish Civil War, more than 1,000 Canadians go to Spain. These are mostly homeless men, actually, who, organized by the Communist Party of Canada, go to Spain and fight with the International Brigades to try to prevent Spain from becoming fascist. They lose, and they lose in part because they get no support from the Canadian government. In fact, they're actively criminalized by the Canadian government. Yeah. Canada becomes...
Yeah, Mackenzie King's diaries are public due to a total boner for Hitler. Yep. My great-grandparents had to lie about being Jewish in 1938 because Jews were banned from immigration. Yep. And this is the great inclusive, progressive society of Canada that is against fascism, that fought fascism. This is the national myth. And work like this is so important to dispel this national myth because so many people believe this. So many people have no idea of the history of this country and what has been papered over with this very effective marketing campaign about what Canada stands for. So many people believe that. People believe it elsewhere in the US, but people here believe it too. Like we see every year with the goddamn stupid poppy discourse. People believe that this national myth about Canada, and that's what it is. It's a myth.
Even more aggressively restrictive of Canadians who are trying to support the anti-fascist struggle in Spain after Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King meets with Adolf Hitler in Berlin.
There we go, yeah.
And Adolf Hitler asks him to ensure that Canada and the other Western powers enforce a strict policy of neutrality in the Spanish Civil War. And I mean, I don't know how widely known it is that Prime Minister King met with Hitler. I mean, I know that the story's out there. It's impossible to hide. I read his diaries. They're chilling, like they're bone chilling to read. He was enamored with Hitler. I mean, just over the moon about this guy. And some of it's sort of creepy and weird and in that Mackenzie King way. He calls him a mystic and, talk.
Yeah. America had a similar pre-World War I love of fascism too. Also a post-World War II love of fascism. As we saw with like Operation Paperclip and bringing in all these high-ranking Nazi officials into NASA and the U.S. government. And Canada as well, post-World War II. I hope they'll probably get into it in this discussion, but as well as we saw in the United States and Canada, there was a project in the U.S. to bring in these government officials. There was also a project in Canada to like bring in fascists, from Ukraine and populate this sort of Ukrainian diaspora with these like fascist elements as part of a specific project to destroy the very left-leaning, like labor union friendly, more socialist Ukrainian diaspora at that time. They intentionally brought in all these former SS people and Ukrainian fascists in order to disrupt that. And that's why we now have, including Chrystia Freeland's grandfather. That's right. Chrystia Freeland's grandfather. And that's why we have monuments in this country to Ukrainian SS divisions, because these are the people that we prioritized bringing into this country after World War II. Interesting stream. Why is Canada bad? Well, we're talking about this right now. Uber person, we're listening to the latest Alberta Advantage podcast titled Canada Making People's Lives Miserable Around the World, with Tyler Shipley, author of Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. So we're learning all about that together. Okay? Strasser brother that didn't get shanked in the Night of the Long Knives lived on a Nova Scotian farm for most of the 40s. Yeah, the Soviets at least treated the Nazis they used as shit with a gun against their head. The US just let the Nazis live normal lives. Exactly. Or in many cases, take over high-ranking government positions. Interesting how that kind of works. Well, Uber person, I wish Trudeau wasn't in power as well, but I kind of have a strong feeling that maybe we might be coming at that from different angles. We'll see. We'll see how you react to some of this knowledge here we're going to drop on you.
liquid eyes and his hands. Like, it's sort of, there's some weird stuff there. But I think for me, the part that's really quite chilling is how receptive King is to Hitler's politics. Not just his personal ways, but his actual politics. There's
in Sudbury and Co mines, they hired ex-SS as Union Buster thugs.
To meet Hitler and have Hitler talk about, the way that the Jews have ruined the great German cities like Berlin. They're in our movie theaters, they're in our restaurants. We can't get rid of them. And King is.
I hope the podcast touches on how Canada is still bad, not just how Canada was bad. You must not be familiar with this podcast. I can promise you, they're still going to explore that. Even though this might be more historical stuff, this is the kind of stuff that Alberta Advantage talks about each week. So I wouldn't worry about that. And everyone should be listening to Alberta Advantage. It's really a great podcast. Again, friends and colleagues of mine that do this. Really, really tremendous content. Based in Alberta, not always completely like about the political happenings in Alberta, even though, it does focus on that often. And I think it's interesting to learn about. Teach us a lot.
Very sympathetic to all of this. King himself, of course, longtime anti-Semite, and, had blocked a Jewish family from buying a house in his area around Ottawa. I mean, he had a long history of anti-Semitism himself, and of course, this is a time when Canada is refusing to accept Jewish refugees from Europe.
Uh-huh.
People who are fleeing the increasing violence of Nazi Germany and the various collaborating states. And Canada famously says, in answer to the question, how many Jewish refugees will accept, none is too many. So, I mean, during this interwar period, we're talking about a Canada that is firmly, materially, and ideologically on the side of fascism. And I think I make that case pretty clear in the book. And then, of course, it shifts, right? It shifts in 1939. Canada joins the Allied war effort against Nazi Germany. And that part of the story, of course, has been mythologized. And that part of the story has been turned into, what we're allowed to historically remember. We're allowed to remember that Canada fought bravely in the fight against fascism. And, don't misunderstand me. Canada was absolutely on the right side of history when it fought against Hitler. I just think as a historian, it's super important, extremely important to recognize that, Canada could have taken steps much earlier to stop Hitler. And maybe the disaster of World War II wouldn't have been necessary had Canada not materially supported Hitler in his rise. This is, I think, pretty significant. So, yeah, Canada ends up on the right side of history. And of course, the reason for that is the same as it was in World War I. Hitler's ambition is to become the center of world capitalism, to make Germany the center of, the new world. And the British Empire isn't willing to let that happen. The Americans aren't willing to let that happen. And of course, Canada sides with them. So it's really, in that sense, World War II becomes a kind of repeat in some respects of World War I. And yeah, Canada's on the right side. I don't know that Canada's there for the right reasons. And I certainly am glad that Nazi Germany was defeated. I think the next point, and I won't get into this now, but the next question that gets raised is what happened next. And, if you've read the book, you know that what happens next is that Canada, the United States, and their allies, they all basically reconstitute many of the fascist powers once they've been sort of knocked down.
That's what we were just talking about.
It's fascists and fascist collaborators in Germany and in Japan that are back in power very quickly, which I guess to sort of pull this all together suggests that Canada never, or the Canadian ruling class never had any opposition to fascism as an ideology. That's really...
We're in hell. I don't know if you're being serious about that. Talking about people on the left not liking Trudeau is not... I wouldn't classify that as leftist infighting, because that would suggest that Trudeau is on the left, which is not the case. So, yeah, I don't think... The only people that like Trudeau are kind of like weird liberals, and I don't think anyone here is a liberal. Certainly the Alberta Advantage people are not liberals. And Trudeau is not on the left. Okay, you're joking. Yeah, okay, sorry. So you can never tell, right? There's people that hold all kinds of weird opinions on here. So sorry. You never know, though. You never know. Yeah, Dan Boxes says going to subscribe now. I hope he does. Tired of, as a Canadian, not knowing 10 times more about American left and not Canadian left. Going to put the effort in. Thanks. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do here. That's what we're trying to do here. I'm the opposite of liberal. Yeah, I'm kind of getting that impression.
Point here. I'm sorry if I wasn't articulate enough. It's a bit late out here, out east, but that's the point. Canada was never ideologically opposed to fascism, and in fact had much in common and shared much with fascist ideology. At a certain point,
and as we're going to discuss, not only do we have stuff in did our ruling class especially, and our government have more in common with the fascists. Post World War II, I mean, our entire foreign policy and everything that we've been doing, and domestically, frankly, has been anti-communist, and ensuring that whatever elements of social democracy we might have, it's purged of people that are actually on the left, carrying out or assisting the United States carrying out an anti-communist foreign policy in the Cold War, against the Soviet Union in Central and South America. I mean, we supported the U.S. While they were carrying out this often very violent and genocidal project.
Problem with a capitalist rival, a rival to the British and American empires. But Canada was never opposed ideologically to fascism, and that's really important because
and low sebs,
it sort of it is part of that consistent pattern that goes back all the way to the genocide of the indigenous nations in the starting point. And it stretches all the way to, the war in Afghanistan and beyond. So I know that was a bit of a longer answer, but I hope I've sort of tied together the threads that I was weaving.
So the period after the Second World War was shaped by decolonization in the Global South and the Cold War. So how did Canada relate to those events in the decades following the Second World War?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the most fundamental things that people need to know about Canada, and this I think has a lot of relevance for today, is that Canada was deeply opposed to decolonization in Africa, in Asia. In the period after the Second World War, when many of the countries that are on the map today became independent countries, Canada.
But you, person, you got to listen to what we're talking about here, because we're not going to be proud of being Canadian. You're assuming Canada is doing good. As we're hearing, Canada is not doing good. We're not. That's part of a marketing campaign that has convinced a lot of people in this country and outside this country that we do stand for good, positive values. What we're learning about here today is that this is not actually the case. Okay? And especially how we've used our participation in World War II as a big plank of this myth that we have about this country and how wonderful we are and how progressive and enlightened we are. What we're learning about right now is how this is not actually the case. This is something that's been sold to people, but it's not actually doesn't actually have any basis in reality.
Would have had them remain colonies of France, Britain, Belgium, the Netherlands, etc. And this was a consistent pattern throughout that period. Honestly, it was a piece that even surprised me when I was working on the book. I mean, I didn't think it would be quite to the extent that it was.
Not a fan of nations.
Right after the Second World War, when India and Pakistan get their independence, Canadian magazines are saying India is not a nation. India can never be a nation. There's a cartoon in one of the big Canadian newspapers where India and Pakistan are portrayed as babies, in infants, infants with turbans. It's kind of this racist caricature, but also designed to say no, they're children. They can't possibly run their own country. Canada criticizes Britain for relinquishing.
All my homies hate nations. That's what this stream's all about. Just talked to my aunt who thinks Canada hasn't done anything intentionally malicious to Indigenous people since the 1800s. She teaches poli-sci at Humber College. Oh boy. This is why we need to have like communist podcasts and Twitch streams, don't we? We can talk about this to people, to the youth, because they're not. Humber College is not sending their best. Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say. Just ask when the last residential school closed, and the answer to that is 1996. By the way, for anyone that's not familiar with that. No offense to your aunt, I'm sure she's very lovely, lovely person. But Humber is not sending their best when it comes to their poli-sci department.
Its control over its colonies too soon, and does the same of France and others. So Canada is very much against the independence of the peoples of the rest of the world. And
he doesn't think residential schools are necessarily bad. Oh boy,
links back to that
oh boy
colonial imagination that I talked about with respect to colonization in Canada. The same arguments that Canada makes, John A. Macdonald and his racist friends when they're establishing the residential schools. It's all about, the indigenous people can't rule themselves. They can't, they're savages. They're irrational. We have to bring them into the modern world. All the, and I don't want to, I'm never comfortable repeating what they say, but all of those things they said, that's the same argument that they make to argue that the people of the Congo shouldn't have freedom, that Belgium should continue to rule. I mean, imagine arguing that Belgium should continue to control the Congo. In a short span of time, the Belgian king killed as many as 10 million people in the Congo. It boggles the mind. Congo was aggressively underdeveloped by Belgium. The Belgian elite made sure that the Congo was not equipped, materially, in terms of institutional infrastructure to self-govern, because Belgium wouldn't allow it. It's not that Congolese people didn't have the capacity. It's that the conquerors wouldn't allow them to develop the capacity. Congo becomes free because of a popular revolution, and Canada is against it. Canada, wants Belgium to hold on, even after, when Belgium cannot hold on any longer. Canada assists Belgium in disrupting post-independence Congo. And, for me, this is a case that's, I think, especially upsetting in terms of the Canadian context. There's lots of cases like this. We could be up all night documenting, Ghana and, Nigeria. We go one case by case, and there'd be so many of them. But I focus on the Congo because, of course, I'm sure you guys know, the first Congolese prime minister was Patrice Lumumba.
There we go.
A former brewery worker.
We're ahead of the curve in the chat,
and a Pan-Africanist, and was just a remarkable anti-colonial figure. And still held up as a really, really significant person. In the kind of constellation of African socialism and African independence and anti-colonial struggle, and it was a Canadian peacekeeper that gave up Lumumba's location to right-wing forces who arrested and killed him. So Canada was directly involved in the assassination of one of the greatest anti-colonial leaders in African history, Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba, who was just a brilliant orator or articulator of how colonization worked, of the logic of it. And he was just such a sharp mind. And Canada plays such a central role in that. And so to me,
it's always interesting interrogating this kind of stuff about the colonial history of Canada and Belgium and the United States with regards to Africa as well, considering how, because a lot of Africa has become so destabilized over the decades and centuries of colonialism and exploitation. And then you have like white racists in Canada and the United States that hold up Africa and it's in its current form, or as some kind of example of why like white culture or like capitalism or like Western culture is somehow inherently superior, when we've played such a strong role through decades and centuries of colonialism and exploitation and oppression, in creating the exact conditions in Africa, the poverty and the all the social problems we see there. And then at the same time, we hold it up as an example of shithole countries, exactly. And then we hold it up as an example of why our culture is inherently superior, or why our economic system is inherently superior. It's just disgusting. And yeah, someone mentioned what we thought about Sankara. I would be interested in researching that, because I'm sure we know what our ruling class thought about him. But I haven't seen much about it, but I'd be certainly interested in exploring that more.
Of the part that Canada plays in that era, which is that Canada tries to slow the process of decolonization. And when decolonization happens, Canada tries to interfere in it to get the outcome it wants. And
we were also
Canada wants,
in many pockets of Canada,
back around full circle to
many pockets of Canada also strongly supported the apartheid government in South Africa as well, and really resisted the change from apartheid in South Africa as well.
The capitalism piece is a capitalist Congo. Patrice Lumumba was a socialist. And had Patrice Lumumba been allowed to, carry out the mandate he, had been elected on, he would have created a socialist Congo. So Canada doesn't allow that. Canada instead supports right-wing forces that would institute a capitalist Congo. And needless to say, that was a disaster. I mean, that was Mobutu. You know what I mean? The guy was the dictator for 30 years. So Canada's position in that period is that. And of course, there's other cases. There's plenty of them.
And please keep all this stuff in mind as well. Anytime you hear anyone in Canada lecturing China or Iran or Venezuela or whatever these like designated bad guy nations are, whenever you hear anyone in this country lecturing other countries about human rights and about how we're this like beacon of human rights, when you understand this stuff, you just realize it's complete, absolute bullshit. And that no one in the government of Canada or in the media or anywhere has any right to criticize the human rights record of like any other nation. If you support this history of genocide and colonialism.
More appalling than others.
Hey folks, we're going to do something in this episode we've never done before. We're interrupting you mid-episode to promote another podcast. Now, we wouldn't do this for just any other podcast, but if you like the Alberta Advantage, you should check out the new season of Commons, a documentary podcast from Canadaland. Host Archie Mann takes you right into this country's dark underbelly, uncovering stories of crime, corruption, and all manner of misdeeds. This season, Commons brings you stories about the police. They'll examine the power that Canadian cops wield and investigate the lengths they're willing to go to hold on to it. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app. And honestly, I do have to say, their past seasons have been fantastic as well. They examine Canada's fossil fuel industry in their season called Crude, and then examine some of Canada's wealthiest and most powerful families in their season Dynasties. And we now return to our regularly scheduled programming. So you've brought up that Canada and the United Nations, through the institution of peacekeeping, were culpable, if not outright responsible, for the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. But Canada is really known for the creation and the practice.
Here's an interesting tip, Uber person. I think communism works a lot better when you don't have countries like the United States and Canada continually waging economic warfare against you, and we don't have continual interference with like intelligence agencies arming the opposition and fomenting rebellions in your countries and trying to overthrow your government. I think that's in that situation, communism actually works a lot better when you don't have Canada and the United States pulling this kind of shit while you're trying to organize a different kind of economy that's not just like completely subservient to multinational corporations and neoliberal economics. That's the best. That's usually it's difficult to make communism take hold when you have the United States constantly trying to overthrow it. for as long as they were a nation.
Of peacekeeping as an institution, and it plays, or it used to play, a really large.
And by the way, Sebs, I'm glad you're enjoying the stream. I had no idea Canada was this imperialist. That's good. I mean, this is exactly in the work that I do talking about Canada. This is like really what I try to hammer home to people that are in America that have this like distorted idea of what this country stands for and what it's all about. And not only people in America, but many, many people in Canada believe this national myth about this country, about how good it is and how inclusive and wonderful it is and progressive. It's not true. A lot of people believe it, and it takes work to break that kind of conditioning people have to think about this country in this way, that it's just this benevolent, post-racial social democracy. It has never been true.
In the popular Canadian image of Canada in the world. How accurate is that image of Canadian peacekeeping, and what does peacekeeping have to do with imperialism and colonialism?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's so interesting that, peacekeeping became so central to the Canadian story for so long. The first peacekeeping mission, this is so ironic. The first official peacekeeping mission for Canada was the Korean War, which there was no peace to keep. I mean, the Korean War was one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century. It's largely forgotten, but there were there was a
we love
tonnage
Kate.
of bombs dropped in the Korean War than in the entirety of the Second World War.
Jesus.
It was an utter.
Kate Jacobson, we miss Kate on Twitter. She took I guess she had to log off from Twitter for like mental health and stuff like that. I think that's cowardly, personally. But Kate is wonderful. She's a friend of mine.
Pulverization of the northern part of Korea, but also of the movements, the sort of socialist movements in the southern part of Korea. And I think in some ways the Korean War actually is even though it was an early case, it's a really good encapsulation of what peacekeeping was really about, which was stopping the process of decolonization and or managing that process to ensure that, the various states of the world would join the capitalist camp and would side with the United States and would allow the Western powers to interfere and exploit people in those countries. Korea, after its experience of the Second World War, which was obviously horrific, conquest by Japan, Koreans independently, without any Soviet intervention or any of the other silly things that the West always cooked up, Korean working class people organized the reconstruction of their society, of their state. They formed the Korean People's Republic, and they immediately began rebuilding and taking over factories and running them themselves and rebuilding houses and rebuilding sewage pipes and everything that was necessary. And that was totally unacceptable to the West, that there could be this independent socialist, successful socialist, state in Korea. And so on the Western, side and the South.
This question, are there any successful examples of communism at scale? Again, it's really hard to quantify this because as we're talking about right now with Korea, or we talk about the Soviet Union, which you could hold that up as an example, frankly, of a successful, I mean, it went from like a completely agrarian backward society to an industrial powerhouse in several decades, and probably would have been more successful, just as we're talking about in Korea, or where else you've seen it, in Venezuela and other nations. It's impossible to say, would that have been successful, because the US and Canada has been undermining these projects from minute one, waging economic warfare, sanctioning them, making it impossible for their economy to succeed, intentionally starving the populations with sanctions, trying to undermine the governments from within with our intelligence communities, arming, fascist rebels to destabilize the countries and overthrow them. It's really hard to talk about, has communism ever worked? It's failed every time it's been tried. Part of the reason for that has been because of the United States and Canada doing everything within our power, making it our whole foreign policy objective to ensure that these countries do fail, and ensure that we can then install a right-wing leader that opens the economy up to multinational corporations and extraction capitalism. So it's hard to make that judgment. Yeah, and you've had small examples like Burkina Faso, exactly. But all these movements get disrupted and sometimes destroyed by these like imperialist forces like Canada and like the United States. Yeah, what the West, Canada included, did to Korea is horrifying. It's crazy. Well, Matt's stream, if that's not enough for you, we're about to get our fucking asses handed to us by China over the next 10, 20 years economically. So I would hold your opinion on that. What the West Canada did to Korea is horrifying. It's crazy what shit libs will believe about the DPRK. Yeah, we read every single week, oh, Kim's dying. And they'll be like, oh, sorry, it's not true. Well, that's because like our media class are just stenographers for like the national security establishment, and they do whatever they tell them, and they villainize whoever is like the official bad guy, as determined by the intelligence community and the State Department. Yeah, not only did we kill a quarter of the North Korean population and level all the cities, yeah, they'll probably talk about it as well. And we talked about it this yesterday. We talked about this yesterday, or whenever I did the last stream, Tuesday, during Poppy Discourse, about how there was like an epidemic of like rape and sexual assault by Canadian soldiers in Korea at this time. Yeah, and Uber person, like you're pointing out, it's like we get people come from communist countries to bring them here to say communism is bad, but like we intentionally bring, right wing like fascist people, like in Ukraine example, in order to kind of advance this kind of anti-communist ideological project. Thoughts on Canadian media not reporting a ton on harassment of politicians in Ottawa this summer? Yeah, well, it's something I also talked about on Tuesday, I believe, about how the media will turn a blind eye to like right-wing violence, or the guy that drove his car through the gate at Trudeau's house with it armed. And barely anyone heard about it. It certainly didn't make international news. It barely even got talked about in our media cycle. Whereas if that had been like an indigenous person or like an anarchist or something, you'd better believe we would have heard a whole lot about that. And we would have been cracking down on all sorts of civil liberties and that kind of shit. I have French ancestry, but I'm not French. I'm Anglophone. Cuba's a good example too. They have the same life expectancy. They have like a superior healthcare system in Cuba than the United States does. They've like, in terms of like child mortality, a lot of things, literacy, they beat the US on a lot of these things. But part of the reason they're still a poor country is because they've been under economic embargo by the most powerful economies in the world. Like for as long as they've been around.
The United States brought back Syngman Rhee, a Korean exile sort of bourgeois figure, to be the dictator of South Korea, and provoked a conflict with the North such that in 1950 the Korean War starts. And Canada is an aggressive proponent of the Korean War, which Canada calls a peacekeeping mission. They just devastated North Korea. For people who are confused by where North Korea, ended up, go back and read about the Korean War. The country was bombed. As the story goes, I don't know how true it was, but there was a report at the time that every single building more than one story off the ground in North Korea was bombed and destroyed because bombers were running out of targets. That's how this story came to light. So, North Korea was pulverized in this peacekeeping mission. And, of course, the stage was set for, South Korea to remain firmly capitalist. They were disappointed that they weren't able to take the North, but they isolated the North, and it sort of became this strange, isolated hermit kingdom, whatever it is. And
Zorbitron, imagine if you lived in a country that went through what North Korea went through. You'd tell your children, you would tell your children's children, they lost all their infrastructure and a fifth of their population was killed. Without last-minute Chinese support, the forces of the West would have killed everyone. It's really understandable. They're so bent on getting a nuclear weapon. The Korea War ended in a ceasefire like it didn't even really end properly. Yeah, it's still technically ongoing. Yeah, of course, it's not surprising. Of course DPRK wants to have a nuclear weapon. And if they did not have one, we've seen how the United States treats official enemy nations that do not have nuclear weapons. Like, that's been their kind of main thing that's prevented them from being taken over by the West. And it's crazy when we look at things like coming out of the DPRK, like look at this museum in North Korea that shows the history of like American war crimes, and it's like this anti-American thing. How do they hate America so much? And it's like, of course they hate America. Of course they do. Look, fucking open a history book and look at what America and Canada did to this nation. It's not surprising at all that it's like this. It's not surprising at all. And like he's pointing out too, obviously there's issues in the DPRK, but part of the reason that these like countries sometimes I think develop these tendencies is because it's like they're operating under this siege mentality, which is justified. They are under siege. They're under siege by imperialist forces ever since like they were founded, whether you're talking about North Korea or Cuba or places like Venezuela. And then they wonder, like, how can they crack down on civil liberties like this? And it's like, well, they're literally under siege by hostile foreign powers at all times. Like all the things that America pretends, like we've got bad guys like coming into our government, they want to overthrow the government. In Venezuela, in Iran, in North Korea, in all these places, they can make that claim, and it's 100% correct. Or Cuba. And then we wonder why they develop this siege mentality. Well, it's because they are under siege. They're under siege by the most powerful nation, the most powerful economy in the world, the most powerful military at all times. It's not surprising that they react like this. That's like a normal reaction to being under siege like this.
And in many ways, that is what peacekeeping was about. And if you look at the other peacekeeping missions all the way through, the Suez Crisis, that's the one that made Lester Pearson so famous. Oh, complicated conflict. Lester Pearson forged this peace. Well, I mean, I won't get into the details with you guys right now, but essentially the Suez Crisis was resolved in a way that was good for Britain, that was good for France, that was good for Israel, but which was not good for Egypt. And the Suez Canal is obviously in Egypt. And Canada played a really important role in kind of brokering the very manipulative process, by which British and French capital would still get to dominate.
Yeah, that reminds me, in fairness to Pompeo, the other day he was being entirely consistent with State Department precedent. That's true, yeah. You got to give it up for him on that. And this is a good point, too, because we talked about successful examples of communism, right? And the USSR, I mean, that they were extremely successful on a number of levels. Inertial observer, like you're pointing out, they obviously had serious issues, but average quality of life in Russia has dropped pretty significantly since its collapse. And that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. Not only were they also under the same kind of siege mentality for their whole existence, you can understand some of the things that happened there under that context. And even though it wasn't perfect, they were also being like their economy was being intentionally undermined. And the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism in that area has been a fucking disaster for actual, like, normal people. You've seen life expectancy drop, quality of life, literacy, all these indicators of, like, what makes people, like, free and, like, a healthy society has just dropped across Russia and across the fucking Eastern Bloc. Russia was absolutely looted by capitalists in the 90s. And it absolutely destroyed the fucking quality of life there, ironically leading directly to someone like Putin taking over. Yeah, not only are there legit reasons they hate the U.S., but even when you talk about the DPRK, Groucho Marxist, and it's like, oh, look at their military parades and the way that they lionize Kim Jong-un and all these kind of weird cult-like things. All the exact same shit happens here, and it happens in America. You turn into like the Super Bowl, and there's like F-18s flying over the fucking stadium, and like military guys with flags and stuff. And it's like, what is this? What does this have to do with football? Why are you talking about this? It's just as cult-like. Yeah, the USSR supported decolonial struggles politically and militarily all over the world. Yeah, I agree. And then interestingly, also, like you're talking about Cuba and the assistance the USSR gave them, but then how we've seen Cuba, even despite being under siege and despite being a poor country, because of the siege mentality and because of the economic sanctions and the constant destabilizing efforts that they've faced ever since they were founded. But they've still found time to send their doctors to different places. They assisted in the anti-apartheid struggle in the 80s, while Canada and the US was still in full support of the apartheid government.
Suez Canal, Israel would gain some territory, and Egypt would sort of get screwed
High-cracked
over.
Pyrex.
So many of Canada's peacekeeping missions follow those kinds of patterns. Obviously, the Congo case that I already spoke about, and then of course it gets really horrific. Later on in cases like Somalia.
But you were person. This is what I'm trying to stream about.
A bit, that's into the 1990s,
so we can share the message of why Canada is bad to
Somalia,
other Canadians that don't believe this.
You really see that white supremacist ideology come through. Canadian soldiers, for anyone who doesn't remember, Canadian soldiers left Somalia disgraced after they tortured and murdered a Somali teenager, a 16-year-old, and that was not the first Somali youth that the Canadian forces had killed. Again, the details are just so horrific and gruesome, and I won't get into them, but very reflective of that white supremacist kind of attitude. And it runs all the way through peacekeeping. I mean, think about it. The very premise of peacekeeping is that we in Canada have figured it out. We in Canada have figured out how to run, a just, fair, peaceful society. But some people somewhere in the world haven't figured it out. We're
just helping them.
Sure, that they figure it out. We're going to help them.
Yeah.
We're going to teach them.
It's nice.
Peacekeeping isn't about solidarity, right? Peacekeeping is about a certain kind of paternalism, a certain sense that Canadians know best. And what inevitably happens in Canadian peacekeeping missions is that the locals don't want the Canadians there. They don't see them as peaceful. They see through all the bullshit, frankly, that is sold, here in Canada about these missions. And so they don't profusely thank the Canadian peacekeepers the way those peacekeepers expected they would be profusely thanked. And that's part of what provokes their anger. That's why the Canadian peacekeepers in Somalia were so upset, and when they come back to Canada and they tell their stories, it's all about how, it was hot and it was miserable and those Somalis didn't want us there and they didn't thank us. They weren't grateful for what we were doing. I mean, yeah, they didn't want you there. Maybe you shouldn't have been there. So yeah, I mean, the peacekeeping narrative is really insidious, I think, and it's given Canadians a really twisted sense of what Canada has done in the world, especially in that kind of middle section of the 20th century. So
sure, foreign aid is used in this with this method, exactly.
I really kind of tried to get at the heart of what.
And you say, DOMM, I'm Indigenous, so Canada's been bad since I was born, but thanks for additional reasons. Yeah, obviously. And believe me, when I talk about Canada and when I do these kind of streams and I talk about it on my podcast, making sure that that's a centerpiece of why the government of Canada is not good is always very important, and why it's extremely hypocritical for us to lecture other nations about human rights, considering the fact that this country was founded on genocide and that our genocide of Indigenous people is ongoing, as we saw in the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This isn't our genocide of Indigenous people didn't take place centuries ago, and it's something that's in the past that we moved on from, very much ongoing. And it's one of the main reasons that Trudeau is so full of shit, because he's made it such a centerpiece of his personality and his sort of marketing campaign to, talk very clearly about Indigenous reconciliation and why it's so important and how we need to support our Indigenous communities while not actually changing any of the material conditions for these communities. He's not, there's still Indigenous communities without clean drinking water. No one's fucking doing anything about it. No one cares. And all Trudeau's language on this about Indigenous reconciliation and all these issues, it's purely just bullshit liberal rhetoric that actually is not backed up by any kind of action.
The peacekeeping ideology is, which I think kind of pulls the veil off of those policies.
Yeah, one thing that's really striking, I actually sort of recognize one of the sources for that, for those sections.
Thank you for the sub, Grim White North. Thank you very much.
Creating Canada's peacekeeping past. And the fascinating thing about that is that the author, Colin McCullough, is not any kind of radical, as far as I can tell. but it's just sort of an honest, an honest scholar who looked at the evidence. And one really interesting thing he does in that book, and I think there's a few references to these in Canada and the world, is that he looks at sort of representations of Canadian peacekeeping in, these old sort of NFB documentaries, and in heritage minutes, and sort of shows that exactly what you were saying in terms of there always being this premise that the Canadians are coming in to provide a solution that they have, and that even if it's not, sort of explicit,
Louis Riel mode. I like that.
A very clear sort of hierarchy of nations in the world that's being set up in those representations. Most Canadians receive that message, but it's sort of at the dog whistle level, and nobody would, for the most part, think twice about that being like a colonial or imperial ideology that's being put forward there.
Yeah. That book was so useful for that reason. And, there were actually a lot of books that I found, where the authors were, not necessarily radical, but as you say, honest historians, and were just trying to really provide a kind of honest picture of things, which were really useful to me, because an honest portrayal of Canada's history, I think, kind of makes the case that I'm trying to make, which is the case for this consistency. And in particular, it's the NFB films about peacekeeping, the ones that run from like the late 50s all the way through into the 70s and 80s that McCullough talks through and that I also use. And they really kind of emphasize this sense of like, the very grounded, rational Canadians are going over there. There's this selfless task that they're undertaking to go over there, wherever there is, and help these people. And
you were a person. What's your opinion of virtue signaling from the liberals and Hollywood celebrities? When you're talking about liberalism in general, and I think you can classify most like Hollywood celebrities as liberals, and obviously the Liberal Party, but whatever country you're talking about, this is a lot of, I talk about this all the time, which is that liberalism, it's mostly based in aesthetics, okay? It's using the language of social justice and anti-racism and indigenous reconciliation, and sometimes even the critiquing capitalism, but it's just using this language, but without being backed up by any kind of like material change in how people live their lives. It's purely just rhetoric. It's not backed up with any actual action. Trudeau is the ultimate example of this. Obama was a maybe even a greater example. Trudeau and Obama, though, are very similar figures when you point to them like that. How they've mastered this idea of speaking about these issues and sounding like they care about these issues and sounding like this is important to them, while in terms of the actual power that they're wielding, using that to side with banks, with the police, with the oil companies, the extraction capitalist companies. This is why liberalism is a failure, because it's based purely in this language, while it allows all these social problems that they're talking about to get worse through their actual actions.
One piece that's quite disturbing, and I haven't talked about this much. I don't like to talk about it in interviews, but I think I should.
Yeah, pushing
more.
Biden to build
One
the Keystone
NFB
Pipeline. That's right.
Makes this reference, and I cited it in the book. I probably won't get it right word for word by memory, but it's, I think it's maybe in a film about peacekeeping in Cyprus, and there's this reference to, the peacekeepers.
Yeah, we're in hell. Trudeau showing up to the climate protests last year to protest himself. That was interesting, right? Or like showing up to the BLM protest to take a knee, when it's like, you're in charge, dude. Fucking do something. He's like, I am doing something. I'm at the protest. I'm protesting myself. That's liberalism.
Have said that the sights are beautiful too, and then they cut to the scene of like a beach, and there's all these women in bathing suits on this beach, and it's this very sly reference to and they're going to get some ladies too, like this really sort of creepy, and looking back on it, it's creepy, and I'm sure they wouldn't make a film like that now, but what struck me about that, this kind of just dropping in this reference to, join the peacekeepers, and you might.
I was like a foot away from Trudeau when he took a knee at the BLM protest. The energy got real weird when he showed up.
There's a
I can
horrifying
imagine
recent book about sexual violence by UN peacekeepers. The book is not just about Canadians, it's about UN peacekeepers from around the world, although the book is very clear, and I think it's an important point, that the vast, overwhelming majority of cases, reported cases of sexual violence or sexual assault by peacekeepers is by white or Euro-American peacekeepers. I make the argument that that is part of that colonial imagination, that there is a thread that connects colonization on the land that became Canada with the peacekeeping missions, with the war in Afghanistan, with so many other cases. And one of those threads is, unfortunately, sexual violence. It's very present in the conquest on this land. And again, it's hard to talk about and it's upsetting. And I won't do details, but I do in the book get into some of the ways in which, white settler male violence, sexual violence is part of the conquest, part of the military conquest. And European colonizers did that. They used sexual violence as a weapon. And the fact that Canadians sexually assaulted people in South Korea during the Korean War, sexually assaulted South Korean women, they were supposed to be on the same side. Not that that is relevant, but they were supposed to be on the same side as, South Korea fighting against North Korea.
We talked about this on Tuesday.
Chilling cases of Canadian soldiers getting drunk and going down to some farmhouse somewhere, tying up the men and beating them and shaming them and then sexually assaulting the women. I mean, just horrific stuff. But there is this thread to it that runs through so many of these cases. And so, because you mentioned the NFB films, I thought this would be a
my thoughts on the NDP. There's some great NDP MPs that I like a lot. Matthew Green is a really exciting NDP MP. I talked to him on my podcast, 49th Parahell, a few months ago. Great guy. There's a number of very good. Leah Gazan is good. Nikki Ashton, she's actually coming on my podcast soon as well. There's a number of really great MPs and activists in the NDP, but ultimately it still is. I think it's controlled by sort of this centrist, Blairite, neoliberal contingent, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So, as a party, I don't think they're ever going to be a real vehicle for like the actual political change that we need. I would like it to be, but I think ultimately what probably needs to happen is that the actual left of the NDP needs to split off from the NDP and start a new project with their own sort of leadership that's not going to be undermined like we've seen in the NDP the way it is. Left hands too. I was looking for okay. I was at the protest and just turned around and was surrounded by his sweater vest security. Oh man, my keyboard is just straight up not working now. Yeah, oh my god, you were right there, huh? Yeah, thanks, Justin. Thanks, and when Justin Trudeau came out there, systemic racism was defeated forever. He came out down there and systemic racism just stopped. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, sir. Yeah, Matthew Green doesn't fuck around. He's a real one. I know, I talked to him. Like, I'm skeptical, I think, of a lot of like politicians that manage to get up to that level, or people that are in the NDP also. Matthew Green, I talked to him about this stuff, and I believe that, he doesn't really fuck around. He's a real one. I like him a lot. I should have him on this stream sometime, actually. He'd probably come on. The lady in yellow was super not cool with him being there, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And you say, Larry Weir, that's historically, for much of human history, the soldiers were rewarded with rape and pillage rights. When enemies are dehumanized, it can sure result in this. And we're talking about South Korea, where they were actually allies. Canada, we were like, we're here to help. We're Canada. We're helping you. Thanks for hosting the stream, Diamiam. We're helping you. We're your allies. And then they're committing like horrific acts of violence and sexual assault against the people that we're supposed to be helping. Fucking disgusting.
To bring that up, Because there it is, in an NFB film about peacekeeping, one of the ways they are trying to attract Canadian men to go and be peacekeepers is by this sly promise of sexual conquest. So, yeah, sorry. I mean, God, what a horrible thing to get into, but I do think it's important. I think it's an important piece of all this.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things you brought up in that answer there was the Canadian war in Afghanistan. And I think that's really important to address in this interview because there's a really popular kind of idea in Canada that Canada was not particularly involved in the war on terror, quote unquote, because Canada was not did not send troops during the American invasion of Iraq. Could you give us some more details about the role that Canada played in the war on terror, why the
Thanks
war
for
in
hosting the stream.
Afghanistan is so important, and what Canadians should know about it?
There's a few things here that are really important, but because I've been talking about this kind of colonial imagination, I want to stay on that thread for a second. In the same way that the
I'll
book
take
about
it.
the
I'll take the
Northwest
one
Mounted
viewer.
Police was really valuable to me. One of the most valuable books for me on Afghanistan was a horrendous piece of trash called 15 Days by Christy Blatchford, whom you guys probably recognize as the right-wing columnist who died recently. Just a horrific.
Prayers up for Christy
book.
Blatchford.
One of many of these books that just kind of, what's it like to be a Canadian boots on the ground soldier? But, she's so aggressively colonial herself and her ideology. The opening line of the book is, Task Force 15 was a killing machine. She just glorifies the violence. And the
fucking
book
hack.
was incredibly useful for me because it was, the Canadian military and military supporters and colonizers kind of talking honestly amongst themselves about how great they were. And so what I saw in the many, many quotes that Christy Blatchford had from Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan was that colonial imagination again. Almost as if no time had passed between, the genocide of indigenous peoples, indigenous nations, and the war in Afghanistan. You have, this one soldier who is quoted saying, he's saying this to an Afghan, he's saying, I'm better than you, we're better than you. And they repeat this over and over, this idea that the Canadians are better. There's always, the Afghans are always presented as, they're either scheming, murderous terrorists, or they are simpering, pathetic allies. Sometimes, if they're working with the Afghan National Police, the Afghan police they're always framed as these weak, they're not serious, they don't know how to get the job done. Or, they're very thankful, grateful, innocent, victims. They're just so thankful. They're just, oh, thank you to the soldiers. Thank you so much. You've saved us, right? All of which services the, white supremacist myth. That Canadians are better. They're more rational. They're more advanced. They've got better weapons. They've got better training. They know how to run a state. They know how to run a government, all of that sort of thing. There's a line, one of the soldiers says, we went to Afghanistan and these people he says, they're 2,000 years in the past. It's like they're walking right out of the pages of National Geographic.
Oh.
I mean, right? I mean, you couldn't really get a clearer articulation of colonialism and white supremacy than that. And it's pervasive in that war. It is pervasive. And so it's, it's explicit in what some of these soldiers say, but of course it's also there in a more subtle and nuanced way, but it's also there in the official discourse, right? Which is, why are we in Afghanistan? At first, of course, it was revenge for 9/11, but, that didn't sit well with people, especially when there was no one from Afghanistan even involved in 9/11. So the narrative became, well, we're there to help, right? We're there to help them build a state, and we're going to save women. Remember that?
How did that work
out?
out?
Central to the narrative was the awful Taliban treat women badly, and so Canada's going to go and save the women of Afghanistan. Now the women will get to be in public, and they'll get to go to school, and Canada's going to build schools, and it's all a sham. It's all just a total sham. In terms of the actual reconstruction of, building things like schools and hospitals, very little infrastructure was actually ever built. Most of the money that was earmarked for that got funneled up into Canadian organizations and companies. In terms of the politics, I mean, obviously it was colonial mobilization of feminism in the first place to say, oh, we're there to save the women. But even if you believed that nonsense, Canada actually oversaw the reinstitution of some of the most horrific patriarchal laws in Afghanistan when Canada was basically controlling the Hamid Karzai government. And when I say basically controlling, I mean that Canada had
Instigator, thanks for the link. I'll check that out in just one sec.
Strategic advisory team in Afghanistan embedded within the Afghan government, and essentially making policy for Hamid Karzai's government. It was the occupation that kept Karzai in power for 12 years. And so he needed them. And therefore, Canada had this really, really central role in running Afghanistan between 2002 and 2014. Well, actually beyond, but especially in that period. And in that time, some of the most patriarchal, laws, again, I hate sort of repeating these things, but laws that would allow husbands to rape their wives if they refused sex. Canada and its advisory team oversaw Hamid Karzai's government reintroducing such laws. After they had been eliminated, Karzai brought them back to, appease some of the patriarchal tribal leaders, and Canada gave that the thumbs up, gave that the okay. So even if, you somehow were fooled into thinking that Canada sincerely went to Afghanistan to help women, which I'm not, but even if you were, they didn't do that. I'm just kind of pulling at examples here, but Canada left Afghanistan a mess, a disaster. And, it's not that Afghanistan was in great shape, in 2001 when the invasion began, but even that part of the story, I think there's a really important bit of context to. For a lot of Canadians, and I notice this in teaching, I notice in my teaching, I'll often ask my classes, what do you guys know about Afghanistan? What do you know about the country? And they know about the war. They know about, 9/11 and the war and so on. But a lot of my students don't know very much about Afghanistan before that. It's as if Afghanistan didn't have a history prior to Canada's arrival. And of course it did. It has a complicated history. Without boring you all with the details, an important part of that history is that, people in Afghanistan fought and struggled to build more progressive institutions and a more progressive state. There was a left in Afghanistan that fought for things like, gender equality, tribal equality, secularism, socialism, all manner of things that many of us would support. And there were periods, especially in the 1970s, when Afghanistan was doing really well, comparatively, and in terms of kind of establishing some of the basis for.
Uber person, have you not figured out that I'm a communist yet?
Society.
I thought it was kind of obvious from all the communist shit I'm saying
by
on the stream.
The U.S. support for the Mujahideen, right-wing forces that went in and tried to harass the Afghan government, which then prompted the Soviets to invade. It all becomes this huge nightmare. And again, without boring you with the details, that conflict is sort of what leaves Afghanistan in the situation that it's in 2001, which is that, it is ruled by a sort of theocratic cabal of, known as the Taliban. And it's not a great place and it's not in great shape. But, and this is really important, Canada did not make it better. Nothing Canada did improved the quality of life for people in that country. It made it worse. That's just sort of a sketch of what happened in Afghanistan, and
kind of
addressed
similarly as we've seen these conflicts go in other parts of the world. Folks, I'm going to take a small break. I will be back in like 4 minutes. I'm going to walk around, go to the bathroom, refill my water, listen to the podcast, catch me up on what I missed when I come back. I'll be back in like 3 or 4 minutes.
Directly your question about Iraq, there is this sort of bizarre idea that Canada stayed out of the war in Iraq because at the time when George Bush, launched the war, the Jean Chrétien government said, well, we're not going to support the war unless it has UN approval. And it didn't. And so George Bush created his coalition of the willing. Canada wasn't one of them. And so it seems like Canada did the right thing there. We made the right choice. But it's bullshit. It's just bullshit. The Canadian and U.S. militaries are deeply interwoven, deeply connected. And so there were Canadians who fought in the war in Iraq in a variety of different ways. There was a Canadian general who was part of the planning of the war in Iraq because he was part of a Joint Chiefs panel with the American generals. There obviously was Canadian equipment being used in the war, and there was strategic planning with respect to the war in Afghanistan. So, part of the deal was when the U.S. war in Iraq began, that meant they were going to have to move troops out. There was a troop surge from Canada to make up the difference. So, the idea that Canada took some kind of a moral stand against the war in Iraq, it's just stupid. It's really dumb. But, it's a great piece of ideology, a great piece of propaganda for the Canadian liberal elite who want Canadians to believe that Canada is somehow more enlightened, more peaceable, more just in the world. And it worked well because a lot of people still have the sense that that's how it went.
One thing that I think has rightly gotten a fair bit of attention on the Canadian left in recent years is Canadian imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. What can you tell us about the history of Canada's role in that region and what it looks like today?
In some ways, that's where Canada first kind of flexes its colonial muscles internationally. All the way back to the turn of the century, Canadian capital is expanding into Latin America and the Caribbean. Canadian banks, Canadian railroad companies, mining comes a little bit later, but electricity provision is a big one. The largest private sector company in Brazil at the turn of the century was a Canadian company, which went through several different names. Brascan for a long time was the name of the company, but in Brazil they called it the Canadian octopus, the polvo canadense, because its tendrils, whatever those things are called that octopuses have, tendrils were into every aspect of the Brazilian economy. The Canadian state went to bat for Canadian capital in Latin America. The sort of the worst, I think, case in the earlier era was in the 1930s when the Canadian military was sent to El Salvador and landed on the coast of El Salvador and met with the Salvadoran military government and sort of planned and strategized around what became a horrific massacre of indigenous Salvadorans who were engaged in a popular struggle against the dictatorship. It's remembered as La Matanza, the massacre. Something in the range of 40,000 people were killed, while the Canadian ships sort of sat there giving their tacit approval. They didn't directly participate, but immediately after the massacre, the Canadian commander came ashore and met with the generals. They had lunch, they played golf, and the generals thanked the Canadians. So, you provided a huge morale boost for our troops. Canada knew what it was doing. And of course, at the heart of all of this was a Canadian company, a company based in Montreal called International Power, which provided electricity at extremely high rates because they basically had a monopoly in the country. And International Power was one of the primary grievances that people in El Salvador had. It was symbolic of the way that working class Salvadorans were exploited by this regime. People need power, they need light, they need electricity, but it's extremely expensive. And of course, wages are very low. So, the fact that electricity is so expensive is really brutal. And of course, the profits are flowing back to Montreal. And so when this popular uprising begins, International Power is on the phone with the prime minister. Literally, I don't know if it was the phone at that time, but they're on the wires because Prime Minister Bennett was close friends with I.W. Killam, who was the head of International Power. And so Prime Minister Bennett sends the gunships to stop what he calls, quote, the communist Indians. And they did. It was a massacre. It was a horrendous piece of history that Canada participated in. And that's the 1930s. And, you can run through the rest of the history of Latin America and you find case after case after case. They often look very similar. There's often Canadian capital invested. It quickly becomes mining, which today is one of the main industries. And it's almost always about supporting some dictatorship because that dictatorship will give advantages to foreign and specifically Canadian capital. I guess sort of to pull it into the modern era, the case that means or that I have the most personal connection to is Honduras. My first book was about Canada in Honduras. It's a place where I've spent a lot of time and I've done a lot of work and interviews and so on. And in Honduras in 2009, democratically elected government was overthrown by by the military, and the dictatorship was put in place. That dictatorship remains in power to this day.
I'm still getting
And Canada
reoriented,
was
Sam.
one of the chief supporters of the military coup. Canada did all kinds of political, diplomatic, economic work to cement
I think because like I don't have enough knowledge at all on this kind of foreign affairs in the decades previously to really weigh in with any authority. But similar, like how I was talking about Africa earlier and how it's been under the boot of colonialism, exploitation by Western powers for centuries. You can say the same thing about Afghanistan. Like, it's not, I don't think anyone would argue that prior to the Afghanistan war that it was like this like wonderful place that valued, it was like this wonderful utopia that the US destroyed or whatever. But talked about the 80s and the way that US financed the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets in the 80s. There's a long history of British colonialism and colonialism from other Western powers in Afghanistan. So it's so hard to even say what these nations would be like without this influence, because it's been so pernicious for centuries. And it's actually interesting reading about the history of British colonialism in Afghanistan and things like the retreat from Kabul. There's some crazy stuff in there. And efforts of resistance to British colonialism.
Leaders across the world said, whoa, you can't do that. You can't just kidnap a president. Come on. But Canada did a lot of the on-the-ground work of, getting people to support, we can't go back in time. We just have to help Honduras move forward. They'll hold new elections and everything will be okay. And of course, they did hold new elections. They were a sham. The dictatorship is still in place. And that dictatorship quickly signed a free trade agreement with Canada. Canada has a ton of money invested.
So that's Honduras,
in mining.
right?
It has.
That's Honduras, right? And we also did the same thing in Haiti in the early 2000s as well. I don't know if that got mentioned.
A lot of Gildan has a lot of factories there. Another Montreal-based company, sweatshop employer. There's a ton of industries that have invested in Honduras, and they want a government in place that will support their interests, support the interests of capital. So yeah, all the way back to the 1930s in El Salvador, to the 2000s and 2010s in Honduras. That's been a very consistent pattern. And Brendan, you're right. That is one area that there does seem to be a bit more awareness of these days. It's kind of broken into the mainstream, but it's still a long way away from a real kind of consciousness in this country of the extent to which Canada is, I guess, to put it, I guess, bluntly, but I think it's kind of important to do this.
I got some celery.
Canada is making people's lives miserable around the world. I think it comes down to that in a way, because we're always told
that colonialism, baby,
is always that Canada is helping. Canada helps everyone else live better lives wherever they are. We're always just trying to help. Oh, Haiti has an earthquake. Let's send help. Can we help them? We're helping. This perception that Canada's out there helping people have better, more secure lives, and it's
we're the good guys.
It's the opposite. Canada has consistently contributed to the worsening of people's lives, of regular working people's lives, day in, day out. Sometimes dramatically in these horrific massacres, but often much less dramatically. If it's just the making sure that wages do not go up, making sure that companies don't clean up their pollution, and then the river gets poisoned and people get sick. Whatever way it is, Canada is consistently making people's lives worse for the benefit of a small number of wealthy Canadians who own a lot of capital. And I think we need to grapple with that fact.
So in Canada and the world, you discuss a variety of radical movements and individuals who have resisted Canadian colonialism and imperialism from both outside Canada and within Canada. And this includes, mass movements that had real effects on the actions of Canadian governments.
This is why we say Canada is a fake country. It's a saying that me and some of my friends have, some of my friends and I have. I hear my mom correcting me whenever I mess that up. But it is a fake country. It's a bunch of mining conglomerates that have convinced people that we have a culture. It's a bunch of resource extraction companies, and just a handful of them, mining and fossil fuels. And these like corporate conglomerates that have executed a very, very effective marketing campaign. A very, very effective marketing campaign that has convinced millions of people, both in this country and around the world, that Canada is like a thing that exists, that we have this kind of shared culture and history, this benevolent history. This is all just bullshit. It's all just a complete marketing campaign. And many, many people have bought it. And that's what happens when you have, that's propaganda. That's what it is. It's what we get taught in our school system. It's part of our like national myth. It's part of our fake culture that we have. Oh, Canada, we're the kind, benevolent, peaceful people to the north, and we just kind of are polite, and we've got the Mounties that are kind of heroic, and everyone, we just care about like early morning hockey practice and a nice hot cup of Tim Hortons, and going out and drinking a few brews with the boys, at the lake. This is a marketing campaign. This is not a country. It's not a real country. It's not a real culture. It's a bunch of mining companies and oil and fossil fuel companies. And they've convinced us that we live in this country called Canada. It doesn't exist. It's fake. And all this national myth about how kind and benevolent we are, again, as we've listened to throughout this episode, 100% bullshit, not based in reality in any way.
What can we learn from these histories of resistance?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that's ever interrupted any of the things that I've been talking about has been popular movements against them, moments of sort of political upsurge and radicalism against the Canadian state. That's the only thing that's ever interrupted it. And obviously there hasn't been a kind of revolutionary movement yet that has been able to change
hockey fights.
The Canadian state, but
right.
There have definitely been moments where, where it's been interrupted, whether we want to talk about, the 1920s and 30s when a lot of organizing was being done by the Communist Party of Canada. A lot of work was being done at with homeless people and around the work camps, the labor camps that were created. In 1935, there's a huge sort of upsurge of rebellion in Regina. I skipped over the Winnipeg Generals.
Don't forget to thank the Brazilian conglomerate that owns Tim Hortons for our cultural identity. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. It's 100% make-believe.
Of course, in my hometown, 1919. So there have been moments, there have been moments of Indigenous resistance, which are crucially important, and I think need to be sort of considered central to all of this. Early points of rebellion and resistance at Red River and Batoche in the Northwest, but also more recent, whether we want to talk about Oka or Burnt Church or Elsipogtog or the very recent moments of rebellion, Wet'suwet'en and so on. And I think those are the moments and those are the places where, the Canadian state and the Canadian ruling class has not been able to quite do what it wants, has not been able to quite fulfill, its kind of long historical goals around settler capitalism and the colonial imagination. So those moments are important, and they've had important consequences. Some of the early upsurge is why we have some of the limited now, but the labor
land back lane
we have come from,
and the Mi'kmaq situation too, where they're now like taking over fisheries
immigrants, there. Chilean refugees who came to Canada after Canada supported Pinochet in Chile. A lot of Chileans fled the country, some to Canada, and their activism they brought from Chile, part of the reason Canada had to back down on the Contra Wars in the 1980s. It was political mobilization, popular mobilization that forced Canada to take a position against apartheid in South Africa. It didn't want to. The Canadian ruling class and the South African ruling class were tight. They didn't want to go against apartheid, but it became politically necessary to do so. It became impossible for the Canadian state to be, a complete pariah.
And this is what we're trying to do with Israel as well, and Saudi Arabia.
Here. So I think that's fundamental. I think it's really important. And, I think everything that is done in terms of political mobilization in Canada has to be done with a very, very clear sense that this is Indigenous heritage, and that whatever kind of radical, revolutionary movements we want to build, they have to be at some level directed.
Thanks for stopping by the stream,
anti-colonial
DOMM.
struggle.
Thanks. I
this
really
is land
appreciate
that
it.
has not been decolonized. It is still colonized land, and decolonization has to be a first step as part of any revolutionary project. And that's not to say that the rest of the multiracial working classes of Canada should also be a part of that. They should. We all should. We all have to be. But it is to say that there has to be some centering.
Take care, Rylan. Thanks for stopping by.
Fundamental, because that's fundamentally what Canada is. And if our goal is to dismantle Canada, the thing called Canada, obviously, then it has to begin with decolonization and the creation of something different here that is not Canada, something that is better. So yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to find places to have hope these days, but I think that's where we have to look.
Tyler, thank you so much for joining us here on the Alberta Advantage. If our listeners are interested in picking up your book and in following your work, where should they look?
Yeah, the book is available at Fernwood Publishers on their website. I think there's probably a few other bookstores that are starting to carry it now as well. There is a Twitter account for Canada and the World for the book, which I would encourage people to follow. I post little vignettes, little pieces of the history that is covered in the book. And of course, yeah, people can always reach out to me directly. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm always happy to, talk about, discount pricing options and shipping options and whatever to make sure anyone who wants to read the book can read it. So yeah, and thanks to all of you guys for having me here and giving me a chance to talk about this stuff. And yeah, I'm really grateful.
It was our pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.
Makes no difference where I go, you're the best.
If you liked today's episode, you should check out the Harbinger Media Network, featuring shows like the popular bi-weekly Toronto Eco-Socialist podcast, Oats for Breakfast, which approaches questions related to socialist strategy from an open, non-dogmatic perspective with hosts Umair, Sadia, and a rotating panel of guests. Find out more about the Harbinger Media Network and the entire cross-country lineup of podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com.
That was tremendous. That was really good. I'm glad we did that. I just threw the link in the cloud. If you want to, please subscribe to Alberta Advantage. It's a really tremendous podcast. And that interview with Tyler Shipley was really good. I'm interested in actually probably checking out that book as well. I got to talk to Tyler. Maybe I'll bring him on the stream. Very knowledgeable guy. But that was... Yeah, this is how I want to listen to all my podcasts now. That was cool. That was fun. I like that. That was cool. And learning about this kind of stuff, obviously there was stuff in that conversation that, we probably knew. There's stuff that we don't know. But learning in detail about the colonial history of this country, and the way we've been on the wrong side of history in so many of these conflicts, and the way that we've worked overtime to, sorry, I'm just responding to something in the chat about Tyler Shipley. Yeah, I'll post a link to Tyler Shipley's stuff. Yeah, just dispelling these kinds of myths about what this kind of country is. And, challenging this idea that people have. And I once had this idea as well. You grew up, especially in kind of like a white sort of middle class milieu like I did. It's very, very easy to believe this marketing campaign. And that, our whole culture is oriented around getting us to come to this understanding about Canada, a benevolent place full of people who are polite and kind, don't have these social problems, and we stand on the side of human rights and justice. It's very, very easy to believe that until you start looking around a little bit and digging into a little bit more about our involvements around the world, about the way we treat Indigenous communities, for example, in this country, foundation of the country with the Hudson Bay Company, and the way that it really was just a company for many, many years before they were like, oh, we should probably start pretending this is an actual country at some point. Like I said, it's very, very easy to believe these national myths. That's why I like to try and speak to people about dispelling these myths. Alberta Advantage, that's obviously something they're very good at as well. And Tyler Shipley as well. Great new follow. Canada in the World on Twitter. Find it on the... That was great though, right? What did you guys think of that? Really great interview. Alberta Advantage. Here he is. I just began following. I noticed he was following me earlier today, I think, when I was planning on playing the episode. I just started following him. Yeah, okay, you found him. You found him before I did. It was very slow. I gotta be honest, I smoked a little bit more weed, and I was on break there. Just keep that on the D-low. That was that was really great, though. Enjoyed that. Stuff. Devil's. I'm kind of a rebel. Kind of a rebel over here, even though it's legal now. It's perfectly legal. Nothing at all wrong with it. But I'm still. This isn't just like, oh, you think this is just like fun or, you know, academic talk about the history of colonialism? No, this is like edgy, badass version. Okay. Well, yeah, that was really great. And it was a fun way to, that's a fun way to absorb that kind of content. I think that's something we can definitely count on doing more often. People's lives. Yeah, we're behind the US now. Some states have legal LSD and shrooms. Yeah, we just gotta fucking like abolish these drug laws. Just abolish them all. That's our governments are so fucking allergic to like touching our police budgets and holding them accountable in any way, but just that would go such a long way to reducing I think a huge amount of police violence and the way, you know, state interaction with people's lives. As a rebel, I stopped smoking weed once they legalized it. That's it. That's tricky. Yeah. So yeah, I didn't know about half this stuff, and yeah, I think that's been something valuable to me in the last 2 years. I've really been putting a lot of effort into like speaking about this kind of stuff and to learning more about it, and to learning more about it like as part of like an ongoing process where I'm also creating content, speaking to people that like are more knowledgeable about this stuff than I am, and learning from them, adding to what I already did know about the history of this country. The way this national myth that we tell ourselves is not really accurate. It's been very interesting spending the last 2 years learning more about that, and hopefully, you know, helping some people come to these conclusions themselves along the way. I guess I could, while we hang out here for the next hour, listen to more like synth music. Right? You want to listen to some synth music? Maybe we can listen to synth music and watch mall footage. For some reason, that's just a really appealing thing to me. See if you can get Vijay Prashad on your podcast. If you want to get decolonial, he's the top guy. Okay, I'm going to look into that. I will check into that for sure. If any Canadians are looking to get involved in a non-Stalinist Marxist group, check out Socialist Fight Back. And frankly, I'm still I've been considering joining the Communist Party for a number of years, and I'm still kind of I'm still thinking about it. I had Jay Watts on my podcast last week. He's the central organizer for the Communist Party, and sometimes you just need to go with the real deal. You know what I mean? We can talk forever about pushing the NDP left or whatever, but is the NDP ever really going to be where we need it to be, even in like the best case scenario? I'm not. Let me just, I know there's like, I'll be one sec. Let me just grab this text here. I know there's like these new rules about music. People are like, it's over here. DMCA takedowns and stuff on Twitch. There's like this whole controversy. So, I have my credit there. This is royalty-free synth music by Earl Casey. No copyright gnomes can come after me now. Nick Estes, okay, I can look into that as well. I should make a note of this. And my keyboard is really not working. No good. This story about the Mounties. Mounties may have broken law during New Brunswick anti-fracking protests. The RCMP was violently cracking down on a anti-extraction capitalist protest? You don't say. I can't believe it. Did we need how many years did we need to investigate this to determine this? In 2013. It took us 7 years to determine that, yes, in fact, the RCMP was violently defending the economic interests of a extraction conglomerate. Why do you ask? Sometimes I can't help but feel like that's the RCMP's job, is to basically be the goon squad for these fucking extraction companies, fossil fuels and mining conglomerates. I think there might be something to that. You know what I mean? Maybe that's something we should try to unpack sometime. Because I don't think we don't need a 7-year, 200 plus page report, to learn that some RCMP tactics during the 2013 anti-shale gas protests in New Brunswick may have broken the law. While other practices raise concerns about how Mounties conduct surveillance on protesters, according to an investigation by the force's watchdog. By the way, look for this to expand drastically in the next decade, right? In the next decade, as we approach ecological breakdown and we start seeing the impact of climate change occurring more and more, there's going to be more and more organized protest movements against these interests, and this is our future, right? This is what's going to be happening in the years before we head to Amazon City. Remember we were talking about Amazon City at the beginning of the stream? There's going to be many years of this too, as people start protesting these extraction interests more and more, and we're going to see more and more violent crackdowns by the RCMP, or the whatever federal agency in the U.S. responds to this. Is it ATF? I don't even know. And this is it. And also, I mean, as we're seeing in this piece, the protests at the heart of the investigation began after the government of New Brunswick granted a license to SWN Resources Canada to explore the accessibility of shale gas near the text. Protesters, many of them Indigenous and fiercely opposed to the exploration project, retaliated by blocking access to the site and setting up an encampment. And when we're talking about the future of protesting capitalism and, fossil fuel extraction projects, and, obviously these things are linked, we have to look to the history of Indigenous resistance to these things, which they've been doing for centuries. It was really incredible at the beginning of this year to see these like Wet'suwet'en blockades and protests that were happening nationally. These tactics have been used to protest these projects at disparate locations all over the country, throughout our history. But seeing that start to come together on this national level, it was really, really inspiring. And if you are of the view, shut down Canada, exactly. And if you are of the view that this kind of our model, our economic model, is leading us off a cliff, leaving our whole society off a cliff, and as more and more we need to start getting in the streets to protest this, look no further to what Indigenous people in this country and elsewhere have been able to do. You look at Standing Rock in the U.S., the South American nations like Brazil, Australia, which is similarly a fake country, Canada. We need to look to their history of resistance and also follow their example. And what the Wet'suwet'en protests, the blockades and the Shutdown Canada stuff really showed me, I think, which was unfortunate because it was really felt like it was really spiraling into something even more significant, and it kind of, because of the pandemic, it kind of got shut down. But you talk about America and the possibility of a general strike or Canada as some kind of pushback to our very undemocratic ruling class and the way that they're in control of the levers of power. A general strike or us withholding our labor, that's kind of our main weapon that we have in order to, regardless of what institutions they control, courts or the political system or the media, we can control that and we can extract concessions through that. But that's also very, very difficult to organize a general strike, right? It's really difficult. It's pretty unlikely unless things get much, much drastically worse. But what the Wet'suwet'en kind of blockade showed me, and I think we should all learn something from this, is that how we can, it's maybe just the thing talking just about Canada, we can completely economically paralyze this country with a relatively small number of people. With a small number of dedicated people, we can really just shut down the economy of this country. It was starting to happen with that Shutdown Canada blockade, and it kind of got scuttled. But that's something we all have to keep in mind for the future as we get closer to climate breakdown, and when we start feeling the impact of climate change more than we are now. When things get really dire and we start to the need to completely transition our economy away from this kind of extraction capitalism into something else, when it becomes more and more pronounced, and these corporations that are there using their tools of the state like the RCMP start digging in even more and pushing back against the resistance, and when those really starts coming into conflict, that Shutdown Canada blockade can really serve as a blueprint for how we can totally shut down the economy of this country, or we possibly theoretically could. That was really, really inspiring. Yeah, I saw that Jacobin piece. People should definitely check that out. Yeah, Zorbatron, I agree with what you're saying, definitely. But I think if we extrapolate from those blockades and say, like, what if that really did become a large social movement? You know, when it's not just a small dedicated group of people, but really a significant number of people. Are they going to be able to use the same kind of level of brutality to push back against it? That's going to be the question. What's the popular now in news section? Scary new Nature article about ice cap melting. Yeah, we're... This decade is going to be messed up. Right? This decade is going to be really messed up. No getting around that. Yeah, Zorbitron, I mean, and that's what we've talked about, right, is the way that our education system is complicit in keeping this kind of stuff from people. And I know that's, you know, I'm definitely not someone, I'm not an activist. I'm just like an annoying media guy. But it's one thing I hope I can have a small impact on, is turning some people onto these ideas that maybe hadn't been exposed to them previously. It's not much. The people that are actually like doing the work in their communities, you know, those are the people that we really need to be following, not fucking like dummies on Twitch like me. But I like to believe that it's having some impact trying to introduce these ideas to people that maybe wouldn't have been introduced to them before. Trying to find, don't mind me, I'm just trying to find a video to maybe put on. My half-brother is in 9th grade. Almost the entire geography curriculum for him was about the benefits of resource extraction. Yeah. Our whole culture is geared to towards manufacturing consent for this project. This TVO video. I really need to do something about this keyboard situation, folks. Really no good.
I know how it sounds. Genocide. In Canada? Maybe your first instinct is to deny it.
I challenge you to listen and consider the truth of it, because for Indigenous people, there is no debate.
I am a survivor of genocide.
I'm a survivor of genocide.
I am surviving genocide.
What do you know about Canada's epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls?
This group includes Two-Spirited and LGBTQ+ people.
In 2019, we received the results of a national inquiry, It took almost 3 years and decades of research into account.
The report says Canada has committed and continues to commit genocide.
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 When most people hear genocide, they think of mass killings, like in Rwanda or Nazi Germany.
However, in Canada, it's death by a million paper cuts for generations.
The policies that were enacted against my people were designed to eliminate my existence.
Today's racist government laws, policies, and actions have proven to be just as deadly for Indigenous people as the genocidal acts of the past.
This is why the report includes all Indigenous peoples across Canada.
So how did Canada respond to this report? Unfortunately, there was a lot of denial.
This was disgusting. I will never forget this. I will never forget this reaction to the
Denial
report.
is a tool of genocide.
For those of us living on this side of the issue, we know that genocide is the correct word.
We're intimately aware of the reality that Canada doesn't want us to exist.
It's genocide.
It's genocide.
It's genocide.
Yeah, so just to expand on this, what I was just referring to there, if you're not familiar. So this report came out last year. The report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Which again, that's what this video is, which outlined the ways in which Indigenous people are being confronted with an ongoing genocide, like framing Canada's genocide of Indigenous people, and like in no uncertain terms saying like this is not something that took place hundreds of years ago, or that was stopped decades ago. This is like an ongoing process. His report was very clearly articulated. It was like very, very carefully researched and compiled. And what you just saw in that video, that was the reaction of our media class to that information. Right? That's how our media class responded to like this really horrific, horrifying report, which outlined all the ways that this country is complicit in the ongoing genocide of Indigenous people. Particularly around the framing of Indigenous women and girls and the epidemic of kidnappings and murders and just disappearances of Indigenous women and girls, which has been going on for decades and decades and decades, often with the full complicity of police departments. Not only that these crimes are not like resolved or investigated, often the police and the RCMP are directly involved in these incidents. Right? And this report came out, and this is how people reacted. They said, ooh, genocide. Ooh, that's a little bit harsh. Isn't it harsh to say that? That's kind of like, that's insulting to people that have been victims of actual genocide in other countries. And is it appropriate to say genocide? And, oh, these right-wing guys say it's not genocide. And like, we need to listen to their viewpoints. So it becomes this disputed thing. That was the whole controversy. You know what I mean? The controversy wasn't, let's look at the facts contained in this report, like the very carefully researched report. Let's not talk about any of the horrifying facts that are involved in this, that we're learning about here. Let's not even talk about any of that stuff, the specifics of it, and like potential solutions to it. Because if we did do that, we would have said, oh my God, this is fucking horrific. What do we need to change to like address this? How have we still been failing Indigenous women and girls and Indigenous communities so repeatedly for decades and decades, and why are we not doing anything to resolve it? That wasn't the conversation. The conversation was about the word genocide, what that means, whether it was appropriate or not for this report to say the word genocide. And that was all. For like, that was like in our national discourse for like a week and a half. And that was the end of the conversation. And it was inconclusive. The final conclusion was, is it appropriate? Some say it is, some say it isn't. And that's our contribution from the media about our complicity in this ongoing genocide. That was their conclusion after about a week and a half. And I will never forget that. It was because I was podcasting and I was talking about this stuff all the time at the time and kind of paying very close attention to how it played out. And it was a radicalizing moment for me, honestly, because I saw it in real time playing out, the way these things get swept under the rug. It was very radicalizing. And it's like, I will never forget that. As just like the complicity in our media in the way to perpetuate this ongoing atrocity. The way that they do that. Even people that would classify themselves as like liberals, you know? The way that they allow these issues to get kind of swept under the rug. Getting caught up on the chat here. Co-opting woke language to push back on progressive shit. Yeah, that's those liberals for you, right? I don't know if they mentioned it in the podcast, but a really fucked up thing is how Canadian foreign aid takes the form of bilateral trade agreements where Canadian mining companies get to commit atrocities in the global south. Or a Guatemalan woman suing the Hudson Bay Mining Company, burning down a billiard and gang raping them. It's horrific. Thanks for stopping by, Sebs. Going to protest for democracy here in Peru. Great. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you so much for joining the stream, Sebs. Take care.
What is genocide?
According to the United Nations, genocide is acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group.
There are 5 different acts that qualify as genocide.
Number 1, killing members of the group.
Where should we begin? How about in the 1700s with smallpox-infested blankets?
Scalping bounties offered by the governor of Nova Scotia.
Ethnic cleansing through starvation on the prairies.
By the way, that's another wrinkle to this. I don't want to say it's funny, but it's not funny, obviously, because of the horrific subject matter. But just despite the fact that was our whole conversation about genocide, this was very clear in the actual report that we're talking about. This was very clearly outlined in like the first fucking page. Just saying, this is what this definition of genocide is. This is why we're using this word to describe the ongoing situation here. It was the first fucking thing that was in this report. Very clear. Could not be more clear about what the word means and why our exact situation, why that word is an accurate description of what's been happening. This is the first fucking page of the report. And that was still the whole entire discussion was like, what does that mean? Should they have used that word, or does that, diminish the message? That was the whole fucking conversation. That question was answered on literally page 1 of this report. But our media class in this country are a bunch of fucking incurious morons that don't want to even learn or understand this stuff at all.
Tours. That's when the police drive you outside city limits and abandon you in the winter to die of hypothermia.
In fact, disproportionate numbers of Indigenous people die in police-related deaths across the board.
Number 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group.
Residential schools. Yeah, there we go.
Killed as many as 6,000 children.
They knew what was happening. These children were subjected to unhealthy living conditions,
malnutrition,
medical experimentation,
sexual assault,
electrocution.
You heard that right. At St. Anne's Indian Residential School, they made their own electric chair to punish the children.
Number 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
And to also hammer home the thing about the residential schools also, so we're talking about the children that were killed there or suffered horrific like physical violence or sexual abuse. I mean, just the main purpose of these schools, even for the children that survived this system after being like taken away from their parents. But even the entire specific reason for this school was to completely alienate these children from their culture. And just in and of itself is a form of violence, intentionally trying to destroy their culture. Under the idea that they could then like assimilate with like white Christian society, which they still could not do. They still were not accepted by white Christian society. Hang on, I'll be right back. There was just someone at the door. I have to go check what was going on. Rain delivery. That's right. No, I just got a package.
That's why they made reserves, and Canada has a long history of underfunding essential services there.
In fact, in recent years, Canada has been issued 7 non-compliance orders from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal for underfunding on-reserve child welfare services.
And did you know about the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples?
In
30%,
Saskatchewan,
I
for
think.
example, 9 out of 10 men put in detention centers are Indigenous. 9 out of 10.
Number
Federally,
4,
30% of all
measures
prisoners
intended
are
to
Indigenous.
prevent births within the group.
Forced sterilization was common practice with residential school children.
It was Canada's official policy up until 1972.
72,
Over 100
not
cases of
1872.
coerced sterilization of Indigenous women have been reported in the time since they repealed that policy.
Number 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
The 60s scoop. Up to 20,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families.
Residential schools, up to 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families.
The Millennium Scoop. More than half of the children currently in Canadian foster care
I'll drop
are
a link.
Indigenous, taken from their families.
I'll drop a
For the
link
past
after this.
150 years, this country has taught its children, its future police officers, politicians, doctors, and editors to look away from Canada's true history, to avert their eyes to the Indian problem, or to treat it as a problem of Indigenous people's own making.
Why is it important to understand the history of genocide in Canada? Because it's not history.
It's still happening right now.
There is a violence and a complicity in looking away.
Inaction is an action too.
So long as we deny Canada's true history, violence and oppression can and will continue to happen.
Where do we go from here?
How do we make Canada a safe place for Indigenous people, and especially for women and girls?
For me, it means doing the equal and opposite of what was done to us. It means rooting ourselves in our cultural knowledge and supporting women as they teach the next generations to do the same.
Since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the word reconciliation has almost lost all meaning. There will be no reconciliation in this country without basic human rights, without equity, without equality for our Indigenous people.
If Canada wants to help us move forward from this, it needs to follow the recommendations of the report.
Read the report.
Read the report and learn what's in it. Look, we're making it easy for you. Don't just look away, it's right here for you.
The National Inquiry's final report reveals that persistent and deliberate human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses are the root cause behind Canada's staggering rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. The 2-volume report calls for transformative legal and social changes to resolve the crisis that has devastated Indigenous communities across the country. The final report is comprised of the truths of more than 2,380 family members, survivors of violence, experts, and knowledge keepers shared over 2 years of cross-country public hearings and evidence gathering. Delivers 231 individual calls for justice directed at governments. Oh, I'm losing the plot here. It delivers 231 individual calls for justice directed at governments, institutions, social service providers, industries, and all Canadians. As documented in the final report, testimony from family members and survivors of violence spoke about a surrounding context marked by multi-generational and intergenerational trauma and marginalization in the form of poverty, insecure housing or homelessness, and barriers to education, employment, healthcare, and cultural support. Experts and knowledge keepers spoke to specific colonial and patriarchal policies that displaced women from their traditional roles in communities and governance and diminished their status in society, leaving them vulnerable to violence. And there's the link to check it, to read this report. Post that in the chat as well. if anybody is just learning about this, this is where you can read the report and read the summary of it. Absolutely horrendous, though. Extremely horrendous. And again, a very, very radicalizing moment for me was seeing the release of this report and the way people reacted to it. Extremely telling. And when you see that kind of happen in real time, you understand how we've managed to like continue the treatment of these communities for generations. Abhorrent. That is a good word to use. I agree.